So with that, I just want to thank Russ Cunningham, Principal Planner for the City of Oceanside, for joining us this morning. The sand retention issue is very important to the chamber, to our businesses, our local economy. So I appreciate all the work that you and your team have been doing so far, and for coming out to share this update with us this morning.
Thank you, Scott. Nice to be back in front of the group again. It's been a little while. And Hannah, thank you for advancing slides for me this morning. I've spent the last couple of days kind of ruminating on just how emergent this particular issue is. In fact, it's a longstanding issue, and it's a somewhat cyclical issue based on weather patterns, based on the condition, the state of shoreline armoring at any given time, based on the success of the annual dredging and sand placement. So it's kind of deja vu for a lot of beachfront property owners, for those of us that are very connected to the coastline. At the same time, you'll hear from people like General Caulfield, who's here today and has a long acquaintance with the beachfront, that beach erosion, sand loss has reached a level unseen by most of us at this point. And alarmingly, that pattern of sand disappearing in the winter and returning in the summer, yes, it disappeared in the winter, really didn't come back much in the summer. So we did not see a lot of what's called accretion this past summer. October is typically the high sand month. So we're just before the storm season. We're just prior to those north swells coming in and pulling sand either down coast or out to sea. Typically, we have a little bit of a buffer right now for those conditions. We have very little. So it's a little chilling to think what this next year, this next storm season might hold for us without that sand buffer, which varies year to year, but is virtually non-existent at this point southward of Tyson. So it's a condition that we'll be monitoring closely. Over the last, I'll say, 3 to 4 years, we have seen events that are pretty typical have a significant impact on coastal armoring and on coastal assets, particularly on residential beachfront residential development. And those impacts seem to be becoming more profound over time. And it is encouraging, unfortunately, it is encouraging a lot of our beachfront property owners to take matters into their own hands. And oftentimes the improvements that they choose to make, I'm not sure who exactly is selling them on some of these improvements, but these improvements that they choose to make often exacerbate problems that they're facing and create problems for adjacent property owners. So if there's a message I could send today and that you could help disseminate to our beachfront property owners, it's please work with the city. We know how challenging that can be. We know how bureaucratic and time consuming that can be. We're trying to work through those issues and find more expedited ways to help property owners do what needs to be done to protect their properties. I've sent out 2 letters over the course of the last 3 years encouraging people not to make improvements to their revetment, not to make repair and take on repair and maintenance without approaching the city on those issues. And unfortunately, it's encouraged some people to take creative measures. I think they've parsed the letters that we've sent out to say, well, as long as you don't touch the revetment, go ahead and do what you think you need to do on your upper beach, your perched beach area. So we've seen these retention structures materialize on the beachfront, and these are structures that require permits, and for good reason. What we've seen over the last few years is that these structures aren't accomplishing what they were ostensibly meant to accomplish, which is to hold that, what we call the perched beach area behind the revetment, hold that sand in place during high tide events, during storm events. What's happening is those little retaining structures are getting overtopped, just like the revetment. The sand is getting gouged out of those structures. The sand underneath is subsiding. And folks are ending up with either saltwater ponds in their backyards, or they're ending up with these concrete bridges that have nothing underneath them, big chasms underneath them. And I've seen a couple of these structures actually crack in half. So it's a safety hazard. And again, it's creating impacts on adjacent properties that I fear may ultimately lead to civil actions, litigation, what have you, the kind of things we don't want to see between property owners who have common interests, right? And who are dealing with common problems and really got to be working together. And some good news on that front, we've been pretty successful in the past year. And again, I'll reference General Caulfield, who's been a great catalyst for encouraging folks to work together, to collaborate at the block level or even beyond the block level, to come up with solutions and pursue approval for those solutions collectively. So General Caulfield brought together folks in the 1900 and 2000 blocks. It's a couple of years ago now, but you have now secured a permit from the Coastal Commission. And as I understand it from our brief discussion this morning, you're going to be able to act on that permit here real soon. Yeah, so that's encouraging. So what I've kind of concluded is that there are these 6 stages. It's sort of like the 6 stages of Reef or acceptance with these coastal adaptation issues. We've spent a lot of time, decades now, kind of waiting and hoping, I think particularly for the Army Corps. And I'm kind of glad my friend Kyle isn't here, because I might make him a little uncomfortable with some of my comments about the intransigence of the Army Corps on an issue that is squarely within their purview. We have been waiting and waiting for years, decades, for the Army Corps to conduct studies, to make determinations about just how impactful the Camp Pendleton Boat Basin is on our beaches. I think we all know how impactful that improvement is on our beaches, how impactful it's been for a long time. All you really got to do is go on Google Maps, Google Earth, and look at an aerial photo and look at how much sand is impounded behind that boat basin, how much sand rests between the Santa Margarita River, which is still a source of sand, unlike some of the coastal waterways in Oceanside, which have become highly channelized and dammed. And that's one factor, not something I'm going to get into in any depth today, but one factor in our beach erosion challenge is the channelization and the damming of creeks and rivers that would otherwise, during storm events, be transporting sand onto our beaches. That sand transport still happens through the Santa Margarita, which is somewhat more naturalized than some of our other waterways, but that sand can't get to us, right? It gets stuck behind that revetment. What doesn't get stuck behind that revetment goes out to sea. And what would otherwise be nourishing beaches all through the Oceanside littoral cell. And that cell extends from San Clemente down to La Jolla and down to where La Jolla, the headland there, extends out and creates that La Jolla Cove, essentially. So that's the Oceanside littoral cell. That's where sand moves around, essentially, up and down the coast and out to sea and back. And the Santa Margarita has long been an important source of sand. But for the better part of, well, where are we now? 80 years, the presence of the boat basin has made it essentially impossible for that sand to move down coast as it should. So these are the kinds of conditions that we're facing today. This photo was taken during a beach walk with Dirk and with General Caulfield earlier this year. We tried to get out there during a low tide period, but it wasn't quite low enough. Some of us got a little bit wet that day. The next slide, Hannah. I'll show just a little bit of imagery of how conditions exist today. This is supposed to be an access point, a vehicular access point for our lifeguards and other emergency services staff to get onto the beach at Oceanside Boulevard, that can't happen now. Next slide. Yeah. And so here's an example of these improvements that people have been making without the benefit of a permit. This is actually an effort to remediate or reconstitute a structure that within a year of its installation failed. And I just happen to be down here on a Saturday. Most of this work happens on Saturdays and Sundays. I happen to be down here to capture this picture earlier this year. I'll emphasize that this to me was harrowing. You have these three gentlemen up here holding this tarp, trying to hold back wave action for this poor guy who's down in the trench trying to build concrete forms and whatnot. I saw these guys almost blown off of this thing on 3 occasions as waves came up, just during what we call a king tide event. Wasn't a particularly stormy day, swells were not particularly high, and yet significant overtopping of this and other structures on the coast that day. Hannah, next slide for us. And then something a little bit more animated. This is a video I took earlier this year in the 1200 block of South Pacific. You see some hardening here, right? You see a lot of concrete, a lot of impervious paving. That's problematic because what happens is when the water gets up behind the revetment, it hits that paving and it accelerates. It goes into the homes, it goes into the side yards. Earlier this year in the 1500 block, I saw water this deep streaming through the side yards. This is just south of Buccaneer Beach. Streaming through those side yards out to Pacific Street, in part because of hardened backyards that don't allow that water to percolate, recirculate essentially, but let it continue to flow. So this stretch, you may know from media reports earlier this year, this stretch received a permit exemption to basically just replace rock that had migrated seaward and reestablish what is a device consistent with our current engineering design standards. That was done in 2019. 2 years later, this was happening. The device was being overtopped. There's ponding back here, as you can see, erosion, big chasm in the Perch Beach area occurred. We issued a second exemption in 2 years for the same property, and that became sort of a viral event. There was a fair amount of media coverage. Oceanside was allowing private property owners to take over a public beach, et cetera, et cetera. Very hyperbolic news reports and press releases from entities like, well, I won't name any entities, but entities with a vested interest in the coast. And we got a little bit of a black eye over that. The Coastal Commission initiated a dispute resolution process with the city and threatened litigations against the city over our actions. We have since had to basically cease and desist in issuing any permit exemptions, and now we're advising people to go through the regular, what we call a coastal development permit process to pursue these kinds of improvements. But the frightening thing really is that this is a structure built to the current city standard. M19 in our engineering design manual says a revetment can be so high, it can be this wide, it needs to be constituted with these materials, it can have this kind of fabric behind it to hold sand in place. That specification or structures built to that specification are no longer working, essentially. So we have a lot to revisit. Next slide now. So a little homage to one of my rock and roll heroes, a presentation I gave to the Association of Environmental Planners a couple of months ago is entitled "The Waiting is the Hardest Part." We've been waiting for a long time for others to help us, particularly the federal government. So I mentioned those 6 stages. To me, those are the waiting and the hoping. Then there's sort of avoiding and downplaying the reality of what's happening. Then there's blaming and threatening. Unfortunately, we see a lot of that going on in our dialogue with coastal stakeholders. We've reached a stage of sort of despairing and panicking. And the panic is reflected not only in conversations that people have with me and other staff, but in the decisions they make, the things that they choose to do, again, without any oversight or any permit that often, as I mentioned earlier, have unintentional adverse consequences. So we've started a planning process, and that planning process has been protracted by a number of things, particularly by the lack of resources the Coastal Commission has to review and respond to planning documents, draft planning documents that we've provided them for review. We delivered to the Coastal Commission in January of 2020 a draft land use plan. This is where the policies for the coastal zone are housed, essentially. An updated land use plan, updating a plan that was produced in 1986, almost 40 years ago now. That has been with Coastal Commission now for almost 2 years, right? The 2-year anniversary of that submittal will happen in January of next year. So these are some of the bureaucratic challenges we face in moving long-range planning projects forward. We have a vulnerability, coastal hazard vulnerability assessment on our webpage. I encourage you to take a look at that. We have a webpage dedicated to the local coastal plan update. I would take a look at that vulnerability assessment. You can see different segments of the coast, map exhibits that show different sea level rise scenarios and what that would mean for the coast in terms of daily water levels, inundation during storm events, wave action during storm events. And it's pretty sobering. There are certainly conditions or scenarios where if we reach a certain level of sea level rise, it's going to be very challenging to do anything other than what the Coastal Commission would like to see us do, and that is pursue a managed retreat strategy. So I'm going to share with you a nearer term strategy that we hope will be a time-buying effort that gives us time to do the long-range planning that we need to do, that gives property owners the time to do the planning that they need to do for their families and for their estates. I'm not saying that those conditions are inevitable. We don't know. No one knows. But it's something that we should be planning for, certainly at a governmental level, and I think at the level of the individual property, the individual household. So what I'm going to share with you now is that effort to buy that time, restore some beach, and see if we can't find that right balance between protecting private property and also affording our residents, our visitors, a navigable and usable beach. Next slide. Yeah. So I've talked a little bit about this. I described the Oceanside littoral cell and the extent of that. These are bodies that traditionally have provided sand to our beaches, some of which no longer do that. We've seen significant changes in the morphology or the physical makeup of the beach over time. There's actually some evidence that there was a time when basically the Oceanside coastline was more like an estuary, really, that it looked from one end to the other, it looked more like the San Luis Rey Slough or the Loma Alta Slough looks today. Due to enormous storms, I'm sure storms that predate this, these are just the storms in recorded history, that brought massive amounts of sand down the Santa Margarita, the San Luis Rey, we ended up with beach, kind of traditional beach. But it's important to know just how dynamic beaches and coastlines are. They change. Some change more rapidly than others, but they can take on very different forms over time, and they typically do. So I think that perspective is helpful as we go forward and think about what the solutions are. So we are one of the older cities in the region. We have at least 100 years history of beachfront development. And the science will tell you that when we started developing the beaches at the turn of the century, last century, we were in a relatively tranquil period climatically. So relatively docile storm events and tidal events, which gave the impression that we're plenty far enough away from the water's edge to build in the manner that we've built today. So today we have one of the most hardened coastlines, arguably the most hardened coastline in San Diego County. And that is fixed in place, that can't go anywhere. So that dynamism that you see in a natural environment, I live in San Clemente. I'd rather be here in Oceanside, but for reasons I won't talk about, I'm in San Clemente and I'm near San Onofre. And I go down there during king tide events and kind of geek out on what happens during king tide events under natural conditions. So what you see at San O, when you go down to any of the trails there at San O, what you'll see during king tide event is water coming up and interacting with the natural bluff. And that bluff fails. And I have some really interesting video of massive bluff failures happening before my eyes, depositing large amounts of sand on the beach. And the sand, that failure moves that beach inland. So that's the natural process. The beach moves inland as the water comes in this direction. That can't happen here. So we have a fixed coastline and a rising sea. So what can we do about that? The boat basin was installed during the Second World War. That has had profound and unique impacts on our coastline. Those impacts lessen as you get further south and the littoral cell. It was in the late 70s and early 80s, and some of you may have been around for this, that we saw extreme coastal storm events. I grew up in Ventura. I watched my pier there come to pieces one afternoon, and I know the same happened down here. Those events motivated the Army Corps to install much of the revetment, much of the riprap that you see out on the beachfront as essentially a mitigation measure, acknowledging that the boat basin and its effect on beach erosion was contributing to the significant destruction that was occurring on our beaches in the late 70s and early 80s. So that's sort of where the advent of the coastal revetment from kind of one end of the city to the other came about. And what we see now with El Nino and king tide events, climate exacerbated events, we've seen about 3 inches of sea level rise over the last decade. There are models that show an exponential increase in that rate of sea level rise. Even that little bit of sea level rise has been impactful over the last decade or so. But what we're seeing is that events that are otherwise kind of innocuous, like king tide events that are coming up later this month, those are now having significant impact, even when they're not combined with significant wave action. Next slide, Hannah. So what I want to just quickly acknowledge here is that despite the current policy direction of the state of California and the California Coastal Commission, despite the political challenges that we face in responding to these challenges, we have language in our 40-year-old local coastal program that supports sand retention. Language that, again, speaks to how this is a cyclical issue that we're dealing with. 40 years ago, a sand study recommended the installation of a groin field to retain sand. So this is not what I'm going to share with you is not a new concept. Next slide, Hannah. So state policy, even state policy provides a basis for shoreline protection. The challenge there is that it's much more friendly to visitor serving, to the protection of visitor serving uses, and much less friendly to the protection of private residential development on the beachfront. So that's something that we have to work through with the Coastal Commission. So there's quite a bit of language in recent guidance on basically avoiding shoreline protective devices for the reasons established here, and they're all legitimate reasons. But if one of your principal objectives as a state agency is to preserve public access to the beach. There probably needs to be a recognition that we have no beach now. South of Tyson Street, we have no beach for the most part. What can we do about that? How can we restore what is supposed to be a public asset and a public authority? These are the kinds of questions that we're asking the Coastal Commission. Yes, nature-based adaptation strategies, the creation of dunes, and actually I want to compliment folks in St. Malo. They invited me, they're going to pursue a permit for some revet work. But one, they have not done a lot of unpermitted work down there. And they have also allowed nature through indigenous coastal vegetation, allowing that vegetation to kind of take root, literally take root on the beachfront. That is acting to mitigate some of the erosion they would otherwise be experiencing. So nature-based solutions are a real thing. The problem is we don't have the space for those, right? We now have water daily up against the toe, if not well into the revetment. So as much as the state of California would like to see us pursue nature-based strategies, we just don't have the physical space to do that. And next slide. So I spoke to the limitations of natural strategies. There are those in the region, in the community, that are very vociferous in their advocacy for beach nourishment as a solution in and of itself. There was a massive beach nourishment project in 2012. That sand disappeared in a matter of months. Millions of dollars were spent to deposit that sand. Most of that sand was gone in a very, very short period of time. So, what we've concluded based on these challenges, these limitations, is that, yeah, we have to nourish our beaches, but we have to retain that nourishment. We've got to hold that sand in place. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the groins in Newport and in other stretches of coastline that have been quite successful in holding sand on beach. I mentioned I'm from Ventura. I grew up there, totally taking for granted the groins, we call them jetties, the groins in Ventura, south of the Ventura River and the Ventura Pier. Those are there because in the early 1950s, they built what's called the Matilaha Dam, which dammed the Ventura River. And it was a matter of, I think, in less than 10 years, all the sand was stripped off the beaches in Ventura due to that damming. No more sand coming out of the Ventura River. So there would be no beach in Ventura, and there wouldn't have been beach for the last 75 years, if not for those installations. So obviously, managed retreat is frightening. The implications for the city are enormous. The implications for property owners on our beachfront are enormous. And I will say, I have to say it, it could be an inevitability under certain sea level rise scenarios. But I don't think we're there yet. Next slide, please. So we initiated a sand feasibility study. We stopped waiting for the Army Corps to do what it's long promised to do, working with an entity called GHD, looking at different scenarios. Beach nourishment. What would it mean to just simply continue to nourish the beach? Extremely expensive and extremely ineffective. And this is something that I've come to appreciate much more than I did before I got involved in this process. The sand isn't necessarily there. For example, the federal government has not said one way or another whether they're willing to let us harvest sand off of Del Mar Beach. And if we can't do that, where's the sand? Where exactly is that sand going to come from? So having to rely on annual massive sand nourishment doesn't seem like even physically possible, even if it were financially possible. So what we looked at in the study was, that alternative, a pilot groin field, specifically looking at 4 groins placed roughly 1,000 feet apart, the location of which is yet to be determined. Extending the south jetty, that would prevent sand that in the summertime moves north and into our harbor mouth from doing that and perhaps ending up on our beaches rather than in the harbor mouth. And then a pilot reef project, which would place an artificial reef off a stretch of our beach, basically a submarine reef that would interrupt wave action and create. I've learned a lot of new vocabulary doing this work. What's called a tombolo. Anybody know what a tombolo is? A tombolo is a spit of sand that accretes between a beach and a structure that is mitigating wave action. So you'll see this where there are natural reefs where a finger of sand will extend out to that structure, natural or artificial. So we would expect that to happen, and that would essentially create kind of a natural groin that would hold sand in place to the north of that. Next slide, Hannah. So we dusted up a fair amount of controversy when we proposed in a workshop several months ago to place that groin field along the Strand. And we got some folks pretty unstuck over that because their feeling is that this benefits our tourists, the folks who come to enjoy what little beach we have, but it doesn't do much of anything. In fact, could have detrimental impacts on stretches of coastline south. Where, as you know, we've got development right up to the water's edge. But this is what we floated some time ago in a workshop and made the point that the pilot groin field is the most cost-effective of the strategies that are available to us at this time that we explored. Hannah, next slide. Thank you. So just so you can kind of see the reef concept, much more expensive, and there's less certainty as to how well this would work. And what tends to happen, unfortunately, as a member of the surfing community, for years I hear about these artificial reefs and how great they would be and how they would create waves. And almost all of them have failed. Efforts to not necessarily retain beach, but to create surfing resources. Most of those have never worked. There was a spectacular failure of one of those up by LAX in El Segundo several years ago. So this strategy seems riskier and also more expensive. Next slide, yeah. So just an image of how the South Jetty might be extended. Obviously, that's a very significant extension of that existing device. But what you see in this photo is that phenomenon that I think we're all familiar with. Sand accretes behind these structures. So we got a nice beach here where this structure ends right about here now. That holds sand here on Harbor Beach. Next slide. So I mentioned that the groin field came out on top in this multi-criteria analysis looking at beach restoration, downdrift impacts, public safety factors, adaptability to sea level rise, cost factors, and environmental impacts. So when we looked at all of those criteria, we concluded that the groin field is essentially our best option. Next slide now. So this just kind of shows it in graphical form. You can see the reefs actually did pretty well. From an environmental standpoint, maybe slightly friendlier to the environment than the groins, but not by much. Cost effectiveness is a huge factor here in the groins coming out on top. Next slide, please. So with that information, with the input that we've gotten from the community, and with the direction we've gotten from Councilmember Weiss and his colleagues on the City Council, we will be pursuing a second phase of this project, going kind of from the conceptual to the nitty-gritty to the engineering, designing a groin field. And simultaneously, we have a great traffic engineer, Hamid Bahadori. He's been recently brought into this effort as our interim public works director. Hamid said something really profound the other day. The engineering of this is going to be the easy part. We know these structures work. We know how to construct them. We know how to monitor their impacts. The hard part is going to be the political part. It's going to be engaging people in the region, at the state level, and at the federal level to get them behind this effort. So in the RFP that we put out a week ago, we're soliciting not only engineering services, but also, frankly, public relations services, lobbying services, public outreach services from folks who are familiar with these issues, have connections, and know how to engage stakeholders.